So now that we're at this stage, where we're still talking about this, like the death and resurrection as pertaining to these interpretations within the New Testament, kind of went over the topics of, kind of the context in terms of like the systemic dominion in Rome and the persecution of the church in reference to some of the establishment of Judaism within Jerusalem, and this shift in confrontation and this kind of like initially like this other like Christian Jewish movement coming into like confrontation with other like religious authorities within the like different factions of Judaism, and just looking at the development of Paul in the midst of that, his character, and so kind of introducing those ideas, right? And so now that we've kind of gone through like the context and the system and the religious negotiations, and then the introduction of Paul and his like distinct influence on the world stage, and the stage of kind of like the like utter transformation that he gives reference to, kind of like the death, the system of death, and then unto life and rebirth, and the transition of the law, and spiritual freedom, and the stage of spiritual freedom to enter into these other forms of kind of like the Abrahamic call unto the earth and the nations, and breaking down that dividing wall between Jew and Gentile, male, female, slave or free, and just all these certain like class divisions and whatnot. So then we're kind of coming back to this topic within what they like the Gospels, that are the first 4 books of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, which kind of give a summary of the life of Jesus, or the story and the ministry of Jesus from various perspectives, right? And so as we approach this topic of like the death and resurrection and its connotation and symbolism and practice, and how even at the time the disciples seem to not really know what's going on. So it seems to be revealing itself in a different way than they had expected as they're going along, right? To the point where they're still kind of expecting it to simply just be kind of like a switch of administration and putting a better representation like in those like seats of like religious or political influence. And then Jesus kind of portrays like it's not that, it's like more of the beginning stages of a all-encompassing transformation, and their seeds are planted for that. Then we've kind of talked about how Paul kind of picks up on that, and it becomes this like utter transformative movement that begins to evolve these like ideas in the midst of persecution all around. And so then we kind of get back to this question though, so later Paul gives reference to like attributed to certain theories and proposals from the like development after this topic of like the death and resurrection and whatnot. And so then we go back to those teachings, right? We go back to the practice and what it kind of seems to symbolize. And there's a lot that could be said. There's a lot of unpacking, and we can, there's certain approaches where we could, maybe later go over like the gospel message. And as I was saying before, there's various ones that have combed through it, and they're developing these discussions and questioning what is it that Jesus actually said, where does he actually attribute himself to being God, or is he the Son of God, or is he, how do we utilize this language of God the Father, God the Son, and the like the ministry of the Holy Spirit. And so there's all of those things that could be done, and people are having those conversations, right? And maybe we'll kind of circle back to that, but right now I just kind of want to, so some of my talking through, so these stages of just simply talking through is just kind of a general idea, introducing some of the things that I'm thinking about, and I'm sure there'll be times to like go into it in more depth and utilize scripture and whatnot, but this is just kind of like a talking through. And so as we think about these topics of, like the death and resurrection, and I have listened to, and it's really useful for me, and how it's helpful to listen to other contributors and their interpretation, and I've spent a lot of time listening to some of those, but as I'm listening to like various ones talk about it, A lot of it seems to be at this stage where, and there's a time for this, and there's usefulness of it, and it's very much a contribution, like to preserve these things, and ends up being this discussion as to whether, like, people that are defending whether it happened or not. And so a lot of times it's almost approached as though people are in general kind of already arriving upon kind of like a conclusion as to like the death and resurrection and what some of these like storylines mean. And what they're trying to do when they're talking about some of these subjects outside of this is generally whether or not they could prove that it happened. Did it happen or did it not happen? And as I was saying, it's helpful and useful to do that because at some point we need to kind of keep some of these things alive, you know, like it's good for people to kind of push back and not just totally delete this influence of these storylines and whatnot. But at the same time, I also think there's room to keep going further and looking at like possibly what is a possible next level of revelation and understanding and things along those lines, and not just defending whether there was a resurrection or not. And so for me, as I was listening to various storylines and various ones talking about these things, what I started to think about was not so much just saying, like, do you believe that there was a literal death and resurrection and things along those lines? And for me, I just don't necessarily feel too compelled to have to do that. There's ways you can look at the text, and as I was saying, people do that and they kind of suppose whether or not it's true, or they develop a defense for like whether it's true or not. I think for me, what I approach, or how I kind of approach it, is even if it's true, even if there was evidence that it's true, what does it serve? Why does this happen? Why is this supposed in the story, and how does it fit with like the previous development stages? And even if it's like radically transforming the way the story is, there still should be a way that it fits, like even if we have to interpret it and understand it like these many years out, right? So we're looking back on it and we're like, what actually was happening there? Why did God take this path and approach things through this mechanism or symbolism or approach? And there's just so many things to ask along those lines. So those are kind of the questions that I'm asking. I'm kind of like, why is this useful? What does this even serve, and what does it portray or do? Even if we're looking at it in the context of the times in relation to other similar stories and things along those lines, like what is this story even functioning for or doing? Why would God incorporate these types of symbols and stories and whatnot? So I guess along those lines, something that I'm kind of asking myself, you know, like in approaching this question, as I was saying, is not so much like just looking at proving whether there was like truth in it or not, but like what the storyline of it like resolved in terms of the evolving storyline. And so then I have to ask myself, what does the death and resurrection story, and then the way that it's introduced, even among various similar ancient texts, seem to propose a resolve for what was like the perpetual conflict in the story, which was how to be free from world dominion and how to fulfill the work of God through that section of like Moses and the temple. And then also how to approach this resolve through also alleviating the animation of what in the story becomes like the blood accounts, right? So functioning through the story is like the blood accounts, and having to strategize this certain path of God in relation to the blood accounts, because the way the story reads is like the blood accounts take on a certain form of their own animation, kind of tracking like the hauntings of civilization and the balancing of the scales among nations and stuff like that. So without going through the whole text, so just kind of like bookmarking that and supposing that. So the blood accounts, the fulfilling of the temple to stay in line with the path of God, and relieving the world dominion, right? Therefore, like, the result of it should be having an ability to approach God without the hauntings of the blood account, and then staying in the path of God and being free from, like, and confronting the claims that through the skewed development of these things, the dominions would draw upon themselves a type of power. So they'd leverage various factors of the system, and this is how they would, like, preserve a type of power, right? So at this point, whether we're saying this is true or not, or arguing the point as to, like, truthfulness of it, it seems like this is what the story is portraying and saying, at least in keeping with the story, right? And so along those lines, it does seem to account for those things. It does seem to provide this claim of resolving those things, keeping in line with the path of God through this, like, certain approach to the temple, resolving the animation of these claims that the world powers use in terms of the blood accounts, resolving that power, but then also confronting, like, the falseness of the God King claims of the world dominions, and then ushering in a sense of a liberated system, right? Which is, like, supposed to be this kingdom with a heavenly realm, not a kingdom of this world, and things along those lines. And so it's those things that it seems like the story is resolving and atoning for. And so you can still use, like, the atonement language and, like, the new kingdom and a kingdom out of this world language. And then we can kind of look at, like, how did it resolve the blood accounts and the stage of the temple, and then it kind of speaks in terms of, like, having to transition it into this new spiritual movement that Paul is making reference to and whatnot. And so then we have to kind of look at those things and kind of unpack what's going on there. So some of the language that the text seems to use, and, like, even Paul in various ones, like, so making reference to, you know, like, what he calls, like, this, like, essentially, like, this system of death, the kingdoms of the world, and this system of death that leads, like, unto death, and is developed and built through these strategies of death, and kind of bringing parameters around it and portraying the stage of it kind of being referenced into being deconstructed, and then testifying that that reference point refers to the ability for kind of like this resurrected system to then have testimony to a better system situated and kind of putting the system of death in check, to then give way to this, like, new, renewed, liberated kingdom unto the heavens, unto God, aligning people with God, and this whole, like, redemptive narrative, right? And so along those lines, it's not too difficult to account for it and say, all right, we can kind of see that that's happening. Something along those lines, like, does seem to be happening. But why does it seem like there has to be, like, this sacrifice, and then Jesus dies and comes back to life, and, like, other ancient stories kind of make these claims? Like, how is he incorporating these claims in these stories? And like, what's going on there? What is that symbolizing? So along these lines, there's a lot to kind of unpack, to draw from the symbolism. And as I was saying, at the time, it seemed that even the disciples that seemed to spiritually resonate with Jesus knew that there was a need for reforms, because there was both through, like, the connections of, like, the Roman Empire in all these different regions, but then also, like, the association of, like, the temple establishment and various, like, religious establishment that are kind of functioning to kind of be oppressive to people in the Judea, Samaria, and surrounding regions area. They knew that there needed to be some levels of reform, that it was just kind of functioning as, like, this occupying, diminishing like interaction. And so it wasn't too difficult to sell people a story of needing some relief from it. But they still were at that stage where, as I was saying before, they viewed it as kind of like the reemergence of a certain type of, maybe like David or Solomon's kingdom, in that same type of fashion, like a worldly kingdom of like Jerusalem, and then reestablishing another temple, and it would be like the final temple, and they would like reinstitute like the sacrificial system through the laws of Moses and kind of become reestablished, and it would end up like becoming a form of like the reestablished like renewed kingdom of Israel and whatnot, in that same type of fashion and form, like a world kingdom, kind of like in resistance to other world kingdoms. And that was generally the approach that they were expecting this like hoped for renewal to take. But what you start to find is the story started to shift even beyond what the disciples were expecting, right? And they're starting to find that Jesus started saying stuff and developing certain ideas where he was making reference to the temple being different, right? He was making reference to things that even was baffling to them, and saying like, basically like that he is the temple, like destroy this temple and the temple will be rebuilt. And then there's other types of references that he was making, basically concluding that he was portraying that he would be a type of like living temple. And then the connotation of that in reference to a temple, because if you look at the template of the temple, then it would be this expectation that God would reside in the holy place, which is like in the center being. And so just to kind of oversimplify it, so he's kind of saying he would be the temple and God would reside within. And likened to this expression and revelation of the temple would be that God could then be revealed to be residing within the being of mankind, or of our being, of our body. Really starts to kind of transition. So you can kind of see that people were listening to these things and hearing his teachings, while at the same time like almost disregarding it, almost as though, okay, Jesus is saying these mystical things, but we're also still expecting like a literal kingdom and whatnot. And so you can kind of see they weren't exactly understanding how this was going to continue to evolve. But when we look back on the text, we start to realize, oh, Jesus actually seemed to mean that he was the new temple. He was the cornerstone, the new building blocks, developing this new temple. So the expected third temple was like manifest through the beginnings of Jesus being the first building block, the cornerstone, and that as we incorporate this movement, we're like the other building block. We are the other portions of building this temple, this body, this unit, right? And that it's then revealed that there's no longer this need to go through the temple with those certain types of sacrificial offerings, that God resides within us, and we have this spiritual compass like quickened and encompassed within us, and then we grow and develop, and through this then we create this renewed kingdom as a unit body, these bodies like kind of knit together, formulating kind of like the hands and feet of what this becomes. We can kind of read the storyline along those terms, and we could see those claims, and we could see evidence of those claims. And we can kind of, in our day and age now that we're so far removed from some of these things, we can kind of suppose like, okay, they're taking a leap there to where they're supposing that we should be able to individually, personally access God. And so in this day and age, we can kind of reason through that and see that, right? But at the time, that would have been, like a difficult thing to hear when you're expecting like a physical temple and a physical renewal of things. And then all of a sudden you kind of get these mystic teachings where it's like a transformative, transcendent type version, and it totally is resituating and the whole thing. Then the question would be, like if we're kind of looking at the pieces of this and the portions of it, the components and the trying to stay in line with like the stages that God functions through in the story, what you find in the story is they have to figure out how they're making that leap. They're not always figuring out exactly how to make that leap. They're resonating with simply just following Jesus, and they're not always articulating how like the in-between, like the space between, like the missing link. They're seeing he's making these claims, but they're trying to catch up into developing and articulating this movement. And then Paul also is a part of like articulating this as well. And so then story-wise, you're kind of you're very much confronted with, okay, we see the result. It's like Jesus becomes the cornerstone, the building of this temple where God is residing within the flesh of, like the temple is like this flesh, human body temple, and God is within. The animation of God is revealed as being within. And you can kind of start seeing the comparisons where you can, they're introducing these ideas that like the temple and the tent of meeting was just kind of like like it's, like it says, like some of these practices were a shadow of things to come. It was a template of what would then be incorporated within. And they kind of draw upon passages from like Jeremiah and whatnot, where it does kind of state that eventually there would be a new covenant, and the laws would be written on their hearts, and they would no longer have these like outward priest like requirements in terms of approaching and being incorporated in this like connection to God, right? And so you can kind of see some of it, like the seeds planted, and they're like drawing from scripture, and they're creating these like this reasoning, right? So if then you're like acknowledging and looking at that the previous like foundational like Old Testament text and part of the storyline is making reference to eventually part of the leap that will be made is that there no longer will be this like outward temple requirement, or this some of these portions of the covenant and the laws will be written on one's heart. And so you can kind of see eventually some type of supposing along those lines. But it's almost as though people are, like seeing that, but not really assuming in practice that it would then confront a majorly transformative stage of viewing the temple and the priesthood in relation to the world and all of these things, right? But what you're finding now is that it's starting to like be unearthed and developed. And so then eventually, once they're kind of confronted with these like hints of this going on, and it's not really within like kind of like the consciousness of what people are expecting. So you see this movement then having to like really push against these expectations of this other type of renewal, like a physical temple and all of these things, and then what that generates on the world stage, and what that like facilitates through functions of the temple and the logistics and the physical aspects of the temple on the world stage in relation to connections to the world dominions and the economy and the market, just all of these other factors, because it's like in a physical state, right? But what you find in the story, when we look back in retrospect, this is like kind of what's being unearthed. This is like what's developing in the midst of the story. And it's kind of colliding with, at the time, people that were kind of functionally guardians of this certain ideology. And for them, they're not really seeming ready for this type of transformative approach. It doesn't even make sense to them. They're not really interpreting what's being said through what's actually being proclaimed. They're like kind of reverting back to certain standards and criteria as to like what makes sense to them, and that in like the general public expectation. And so then what you're finding is that like Jesus seems to be making reference to them through like seeds planted or little hints of it here and there, that
he's kind of planting those seeds in the midst of where it's not going to make sense yet. And so you don't see it starting to develop and really become evolved and you in this like articulated movement, justification for these movements, until later on. And you see that starting to slowly develop with the movement striving to stay alive and striving to articulate, develop these theories along these lines. So what you find, though, is little hints of planting those seeds to provide justification for this transitional movement. So then the question becomes, if you're even looking at it almost like a math equation or like the legalities of it, the question kind of becomes like, what's the justification to kind of resolve that space between where you have the proclamation of the temple transitioning into this other type of form of temple residing within like the body of Christ and the pieces of the network of humanity being built together, and it not being this like the priesthood of Moses and whatnot. Then you have to kind of look at what justifies properly bringing that stage into fulfillment, because it reads in the story as though God can't go against his word, and there has to be some type of proper fulfillment. And so there's a lot of interpretation along those lines. And so this is it goes into the territory of people supposing what provides the justification for that. How do they transition from the covenant or the protocol that was instituted through like the stage of the law of Moses and then transition out from it. So this kind of helps provide the context for some of this dialogue that's happening where it comes across as like Jesus is speaking blasphemy and heresy against the temple and the establishment and the protocol and the claims of God. And he's trying to make these like outlandish proclamations and whatnot. And he seems to be referring to like old scripture, and it's just kind of like seems way out there. But it's also very confronting to various ones as well. And this also helps to explain some of what Paul seems to be talking about when he's arguing his point for being able to go beyond the stage of the law through this form of what he kind of describes as like the system connected to death, and then the fullness of death, and then death and resurrection. And then once there's a proclamation of death, then there can be the release of vows and release of certain contracts and whatnot, and then reestablishing like a new system or a kingdom. And so it kind of goes along with him trying to like justify along those lines and argue some of those points and whatnot. But another approach, though, that people kind of take and just kind of like simply put is and this is kind of an arguing point for various ones as well, but also like in Jeremiah, it does seem to, and I forget the exact passage, but when it's talking about eventually there being the law being written on their hearts and minds and not being taught by like an outwardly teacher, but it kind of being incorporated within, like the spiritual movement residing within, it does preface that with explaining that at that point the covenant had been broken. So there was kind of like this expectation that these certain approaches and developments would be in line with like God serving God's, like God honoring his side of the deal and the people called honoring their side of the deal. And so it's kind of written as long as they abide within these certain commands and certain expectations, then it would preserve this certain type of covenant. And in line and in keeping with that would develop this protocol by which God would function through like certain developments through the temple and the law and other things. And so in those lines, what Jeremiah talks about is that they had basically broken the contract, and like in so many words. So the covenant was broken, and so there were still some ways that God is functioning through the remnant of some portions of contribution, but essentially like the path of that development and that trajectory, like that covenant has been broken. And so eventually there would be this emergence of this, like a new covenant. Some people will say though, well, Jeremiah said that, but then it still went on to build this other temple, and it seemed to coincide with, maybe there was like a growing spiritual movement, but at the time there was also they were still seeking to like rebuild and redevelop and whatnot. And so then there was like this other temple built, because that was spoken of at a time when they went into captivity, and it was, prophesied that there would be some type of like being reestablished and rebuilt within Jerusalem. And so, it could be that they interpreted it differently, because then it kind of still went on to like a level of rebuilding and being reestablished, seemingly along that same trajectory. You can kind of suppose and read that at the time God was not obligated to still work through those mechanisms in terms of some kind of like vow or contract, or working on behalf of like the words of God and the proclamations of God and whatnot. So at the time, what it seems to help people justify is this is the stage where then God is no longer working through like the entirety of the template of the tribes in relation to the law of Moses, in relation to those types of establishment and the layout of certain plots of land, and like kind of the exacting of like certain genealogies and lineages in that like certain type of way, that he is working through what is then defined as like the remnants. There are certain types of remnants, but it's not going to be like, it's not like reestablished in the same order as the template of the entirety of the law. And so they do seem to acknowledge through the text that they're functioning through the remnant of it. There then seems to be this reference that is being made toward like a generalization of like instead of all of the tribes and all of the like certain genealogies and lineages and protocol, it's then referenced to, because they had gone into warfare and conflict, they had gone outside of the mechanisms and the practices of God, and so now they're functioning in like the breakdown and stages of collapse and then the remnant. And so there's this generalization of like the north and the south and the different divisions and fractions of Israel, and they're kind of piecing it together, and there's this remnant developing and holding together some portions of reestablishing the second temple through or within captivity and in partnership in relation to Babylon and then Cyrus and basically world dominion. And so that's kind of what I talked about before in terms of like the stages of like captivity narratives in relation to the temple and the remnant of the temple, in relation to Judea and Samaria, the north and the south, in relation to world dominion. Through that stage, when they reestablish portions of the temple, then this is where they tend to seem to, like in some factions, start to reestablish like a expectation where they start interpreting the scriptures as reestablishing, as I was saying, like the third temple as a renewal of the entirety of the initial vision of the Mosaic law and the tribes and the priesthood and the literal temple. And they're doing this in continual alliance with the world dominion in some sense, and certain types of taxes and whatnot. So then that's kind of what sets the stage at the time of Jesus, what he's confronting, because then they're confronting that type of partnership had become corrupt and had started to functionally become like a occupying force in collaboration with the World Dominion, even against like other Jewish groups in the whole like region and whatnot, and in relation to taxes and the market, the system, and different types of interactions along those lines. In the midst of this, then, this is where you see the surfacing of these other storylines that draw from the other portions of the text that had kind of seemingly gone dormant. Nobody was really seeming to refer to them. There were these certain movements that were starting to draw upon these other, like, very, like, radically transformative interpretations. And these movements were growing because the people needed more stages of freedom, and that compliance to the temple was continually making them a target on the world stage. There were all sorts of battles in reference to the legitimacy in certain religious factions in relation to the world dominion and all of this complication. So then enters this stage of the Jesus movement, which then is starting to propose these ideas. Like I said, the disciples don't really initially seem to see this about Jesus, but they do see that he kind of speaks with a level of authority. And he speaks and cuts through some of the arguments, even when people can't articulate where he's exactly going with it. And he's then making reference to this notion that starts to like plant seeds of this kind of deconstructing the expectation for the theory of the temple. And basically then for entering into this stage of this shift beyond the temple and in confrontation to the establishment that is awaiting an otherwise rejuvenation of the nation of Israel, facilitated and incorporated within these partnerships with like the World Dominion, right? So there's a variety of ways that people can approach this level of interpretation. In terms of having to kind of qualify for all of the different factors, what really is kind of the proper transition in terms of looking at scripture. So as I was saying, there does seem to be, on a simple note, that it could be just claimed that it had said that they had broken the covenant, and so God wasn't required to keep going along through those measures and whatnot. In terms of looking at the legalities in the stage of the law. Whereas there is this portion, though, where even if, let's just say, we look at the story and we're examining these components and interpretive measures, and we're saying, all right, we can kind of see how God then can like function outside of the law, but then we still have to kind of be confronted with the stage where there's other things that God had said that still hadn't come to pass, right? And so you could just say that God could just kind of abort the whole mission and say, okay, well, I had these certain, I had these certain plans and I can't get anyone to cooperate with them. I made a promise on my side that if they keep the promise on their side, and we made these certain covenants and they just couldn't like fulfill it. And so I guess we're just not going to do any of the like resolve of this whole thing, right? And so you could say like in, I guess, at the stage of like legal terms, God could kind of say that. But what it seems to be proclaimed or like drawn upon, so like what Paul the Apostle seems to make reference to, is he's saying, no, we can argue our point because so this is kind of that passage, and people draw upon this a lot to justify like the continual eternal preservation of like the law of Moses and whatnot. But it seems like Paul is actually arguing a different point, where he is appealing to what he calls like the irrevocable word of God and whatnot. And so he's kind of like saying, once God says something, God can't go back on his word. And so, like I said, this is where people make reference to like some kind of eternal like claim on like the literal nation of Israel, the literal continual eternal practice of like the priesthood of Moses and whatnot. Like once God says something, he can't go back on it. But what actually it seems like Paul is arguing is that The word that God said was stated prior to the law. And so he's saying, when you're interpreting and arguing his point, like he's kind of giving his proposal, he's saying the stage of the law has like gotten to the point where whether you kind of approach it as the covenant was broken and so God's not obligated, and like God could just kind of keep the remnant going as kind of like a one-sided, like just out of the grace of God keep it going, but he's not legally obligated to, because like basically like the deal was broken. But what he also seems to be saying is, so that can give justification for the work of God continuing beyond the temple. So he's kind of arguing the point of like justifying what Jesus was saying, like the work beyond the temple and the priesthood. But he's arguing the point and saying God's not going to go back on his word that he had given prior to the law of Moses, prior to the temple and the priesthood. And so what he's saying is like at the stage of Abraham, he made these claims prior to the law. And so that's kind of what he's saying is like, why would God go back on his word? He made these claims prior to the temple. And so he can function through the preservation of these claims and what they represent prior to the temple and the law of Moses. So what it seems like he's saying is like, it appears that the work had been broken and that it didn't accomplish what it was supposed to accomplish, and that some stuff just like came to its form of like destruction. But he's saying there's still a work that is still being accomplished and going forward, and that's what's being revealed. There's enough of that you can kind of follow, and you can kind of see that being established and see that in scripture. So that kind of resolves the stage of what I was making reference to as completing the law in the temple, right? And then we had the other aspect that needed to find resolve within like the blood accounts, and then like putting in check the world dominion and their claim as like functioning through the blood accounts as some type of like God divinity and like God king power, right? So then those are the other aspects that we have to see this like story and this approach resolving. Then this kind of introduces the stage where Paul and various ones are talking about saying there's this like the world dominion and the world powers is basically like a system of death, right? It draws upon animation by corrupting the things of life and corrupting the sustenance and the forms of creation. And so it basically like undermines God by the misuse and occupying forces of creation and powers and death, as opposed to the culmination of the story being about life and freedom and liberation and life-giving and provisions and whatnot. One of the other aspects that the story is trying to resolve, if you're looking at it just the storyline, is this felt distance from God. The sense where certain actions have created this felt like a chasm between us being created in this type of like imagery of like spiritual creatures that have these certain types of almost like this we're like these like we have these like phantom limbs of like spiritual like this desire for a type of spiritual fulfillment that we just don't quite seem to be connecting with, or this like felt separation from God, or just like this concealment. And so some of what the story seems to try to resolve is that it's introducing like, where does that felt separation come from? What's generating that separation? And so then how do we draw close and remedy and reconcile that connection to God? And so what you seem to find in the story, and this is what I was like supposing with what I was calling systems theory, is that we're born in this image and we have these certain attributes that should be a reflection in a perpetual connection and evolving and this living in this flow of God and this like continual life-giving flow. But then we get the story introduced where we kind of get off track, and not only do we kind of get off track, but then the stages of growth and development kind of become skewed, and then along those lines it develops this whole system of division between us and God. And so then eventually what we find, like this is just like to simplify, right? So then what we find is that there's this kind of entrapment that we have where we're in this dominion of this whole system that functions through all of these attributes and draws upon our lives and basically kind of functions to cause us to have to like perpetually draw upon and interact and be implicated in this type of system, right? And so if you find, like when you're like looking through your life, there's only so far that you can go until you finally realize like we have to transform the system by which we're in, or it basically kind of like goes ahead of us and presets the way that we can live our lives, like limits and inhibits the way that we live our lives. And so what we find then is there's this whole system and dominion as this like divide between us and like this heavenly kingdom. So you see in the story there's like this like heavenly kingdom and then this like limiting dominion like over us, and then we are both like confused and drawn within it, and then also sometimes we're deceived into taking it upon our lives. And so there's just this like whole confusion, right? So that's part of the story that's like seeking to have breakthrough and understanding, both on the side of like the way we involve ourselves in perpetuating this, and then also powers beyond us that cause us to be trapped in these entanglements and whatnot. And so that kind of introduces this felt chasm that's needing to be like understood and not only understood so that people would participate in breakthrough, but then confronting the levels of persecution that need to like be addressed so that there can be a breakthrough from these dominion forces and whatnot. And that's part of, looking at the system and the dominion, and part of what needs to be resolved is like this freedom to reconnect to God. And so we kind of see that in the story, right? Like the breakthrough where it says like God wants to bring the heavenly kingdom to us and reconnect us in earth as it is in heaven. And you see that kind of language to loosen heaven what is loosed on earth, and to bind in heaven what is bound on earth. So basically kind of like redeveloping and acclimating to that divine presence again, so we can draw upon these types of like heavenly dominion, a kingdom that's not of this world, so that we can draw upon our lives and then live in a better centered, liberated reference to the continual evolving of our lives, right? So then we kind of see that playing out in the story, and then that's what it's making reference to, and that kind of makes sense to us when we're looking at like the system and influences on our life. But then it goes to the next stage of like, okay, it's not just simply convincing us that needs to be done, like being awakened to the water that we're swimming in, being awakened to like what's going on and these other forces and how to go about creating that change and working on that change. The other portion is why we can't seem to do that. And so this is kind of the portion of the story that is attributed to like the blood accounts. And it draws upon the language that people make reference to in terms of blood and the power of the blood and these like sacrifices and these continual perpetual ancient stories about blood and sacrifice and attributing certain portions of sacrifice to gods and all of these things, right? So we find that in the language of the story as well. So in terms of the topic of the blood accounts, what it kind of seems to claim is, if we're kind of looking at this as a language of almost like legal code, and there's certain attributes that God encompasses where God can't go back on his word, and you kind of see that play out in the ancient stories about these god kings, these like worldly god kings. They also take on those, like, they counter that like challenge of they can't go back on their word either, because they proclaim that they're divine. And so you get these like earthly kings trying to portray and encompass the language of God, of the attributes of God, and draw it upon themselves. And then you kind of get the law and the legalities, and there could be a whole study on some of the various meanings and introductions of those studies and kind of go more in depth. But just in general terms, one of the basic references that you get is initially with, say, like the stage of Cain, right? Cain and Abel. There's a lot of interpretive stuff that can happen with the story of Cain and Abel, but basically what it ends up being referred to is the stage where he basically reacts in error and he kills his brother, and then there's blood spilt on the ground. And so then the story talks about the blood being spilt, and there's not really a way to make amends for it, because you can never fully really like make amends for it. And so they mark Cain, and it's called the Mark of Cain, and so that nobody can touch him. So it basically can kind of protect him from certain types of retribution and things along those lines, but it never really resolves it, right? And so it creates another issue on its own, where there's this exponentially grown excusatory approach that people have, where they aren't, like, they're justifying themselves in terms of spilt blood and taking matters into their own hands. And so eventually there's these other portions of exponentially grown hostilities that are not really reconciled nor laid to rest, and there's not really a way to fully account for it, because it just begins to speak of blood and these certain accountings of blood, and it's not producing a system that's remedying these issues. Eventually then there become systems where like the accounting or the haunting or the taking matters into one's own hands becomes this generating of blood, right? Spilt blood and hostilities, and then not really remedying issues in a way that is sustainable for development in society. I mean, that's just to kind of put it simply. And then eventually there becomes this way by which people seem to, like, certain powers tap into a certain level of control along the lines of blood. So then it becomes this question of, is there really power in tapping into spilling blood and sacrifice? Or is it just the fear, the animated fear, where certain powers seem to generate this animation, but it's simply because of fear tactics and torture, and it's associated with death and blood. But either way, however, one can kind of challenge the interpretations of these, like whether there's actual literal power in the blood, or if it's just like the fear tactics associated with powers utilizing blood and violence and whatnot, because they would also do that as well. Either way, there becomes this belief that there's certain types of actual animated power within spilt blood, and so people then utilize it as these mechanisms to almost like sway the gods and like develop and generate certain types of power based on strategizing spilt blood and sacrifice and sacrificial systems, and eventually then produces these ideas where people feel like the gods actually expect spilt blood. But it's all of these things, right? All of these certain beliefs and ideas that are generated through like hostility, and people simply just not creating these other like aligned standards of living and reconciling and making amends and whatnot. There's also a passage in Numbers, and I forget exactly where it is, but it makes reference to when it's talking about initially, like, Israel was supposed to go in and kind of be this alternative movement to provide a certain temple and ways to like acclimate through negotiating through these blood accounts and kind of intervening on behalf of like this like continual regenerating of these like grown systems of hostility and improper world dominion, and kings then establishing unto themselves their own power and utilizing all of these methodologies of violence and sacrifice and whatnot. And so Israel was kind of basically supposed to go in and be kind of a corrective measure and not be situating themselves with any of those attributes of seeking that type of power or that type of dominion or those types of methodology or those types of approaches. It's supposed to be very transformative. It's supposed to gradually acclimate and shift to the temple system by which they could help to kind of deconstruct the powers of the world by being a type of temple to de-escalate these things and acclimate through and negotiate and kind of provide arbitration and ways to diminish the improperly grown hostilities and blood accounts and violence and taking matters into your own hands. But you find that eventually some of them start misusing the temple, and it just becomes another mechanism to serve the world power kings instead of being a transformative approach. So eventually that's like, long story short, why God is saying, like, you broke the covenant. You didn't go through like the deconstructing method. You simply fashioned yourself after generating and propping up world dominion, of which you're supposed to be pulling down and deconstructing and whatnot, and transforming and acclimating and serving and whatnot, and seeking for mercy and not like your own power. But you didn't. So now it's like transitioning to these other things and da-da-da-da-da. So then that's where you get kind of like the blood accounts. So as I said, there's questions as to, is there actual power in the blood, or is it like the systems and functions, or kind of like a mixture of both of them and whatnot. But either way, there becomes these functions of animated power through these world dominions and the blood accounts and violence and various things. So then to go back to the passage I was making reference to. So in Numbers, it says something to the effect of like kind of warning Israel, when you go into the land, like not to like, basically don't flippantly shed blood and pollute the land, because blood spilt, like unjust blood spilt pollutes the land. And once blood is spilt, there's like no atoning for the blood that was spilt except by the one that had spilt the blood. And so it's kind of like this counterbalance, right? And so this is like a reference unto the blood accounts. Here's the thing, you know, there's all these like ancient texts that people develop where they talk about like retribution, or eye for an eye, or do unto others what you would have them do unto you, where you spill someone's blood and then they spill your blood, and it kind of clears the books. But in the ultimate grand scheme of things, there never really is a healing for like taking a life, right? Even if you take another life, you're not really remedying the issue. There's not really a remedy to the issue. But at some level, to stop the perpetuation, you know, like it was saying at the time of Cain, it just exponentially grew to where people were justifying themselves, and they didn't have a way to like bring it back into a corrective measure. And so as I was saying, like, you can look at that and say, according to the law of the societal approach, there's a like eye for an eye, or spill this blood. But like I said, it doesn't really produce a type of ability for there to be some sort of healing and spiritual return. There's just a lot of animosity and balancing of the scales, but not a return to like a liberated spiritual healing and connecting and liberating unto God. This kind of introduces this topic that a lot of people make reference to, where we're kind of zeroing in on this distinction of, so up until this point, we can kind of reason, you know, to transitioning, evolve out of the temple, and to see it kind of the ideas and the certain principles of it being established within hearts and minds as people develop and evolve and understand certain forms of negotiation and arbitration and substitutionary, like lesser degrees of things and whatnot. And we can kind of see like, you know, we can make sense of the idea that a system and an occupying force can be a limiting factor in our ability to live out our personal freedoms, right? Because then the environment that we live in has an effect on us. And so we can kind of see how that can create a chasm between us and this like ability to live in a more free, life-giving kingdom, if you will, in relation to like the whole grand scheme of creation and attributes of it and freedom and the betterment of our humanity. So it's not too far-reaching, you know, to make those claims, right, along the story. But now we're kind of getting into these other questions of the blood, right, and these beliefs and the blood accounts and making reference. And so then there's these claims that people will say, it doesn't seem to make sense that how could Jesus die for our sins? How can he take upon himself our sins? Like, there's just nothing that seems fair about that. Even if he willingly did it, why would God allow that? And so all of these claims, right, that we ask ourselves and we wonder about. So this is where some of the approach that I take is maybe a little bit different, and we can kind of work through this question. So I think getting up to this point, unpacking most of everything and then leaving it open to like this reference of the blood accounts, and there's other things to kind of work through as to what were the claims that Jesus actually made about himself and whatnot. But this is where, trying on this idea where it seems like we now kind of can refer to what Jesus said about being the temple, right? And so I think a lot of the symbolism that is incorporated within this uniqueness of what Jesus and the claims were have to do with him making reference to calling upon that sense, kind of like establishing another kingdom within this present kingdom that he says, like, basically the dominion of its residents is in the heavenly realm, and it's entering into this stage and path of God, right? And so it can account for calling into confrontation the dominion of the world. And then it can also say that it's in the path of God, attributed to the continual spiritual path attributed to Abraham. But where it doesn't quite yet seem to put in check other competing, I guess, beliefs in reference to these claims, at least at the time in the story, is in reference to the residing the consciousness that at the time in reference to the temple. And so even if someone could proclaim that there's freedom and access outside of the temple, it still wasn't even in the consciousness of humanity. Like, there was still very much a commitment to loyalty to the temple in the very same mechanisms and whatnot. And so another portion of what seems to be called into reference was Jesus kind of confronting the temple establishment. And so this seems to be like an idea that I'm, maybe working through and trying on. And so some of the language where people say, Jesus was the sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice without sin, and he took on the sin of the world, and then he became the atonement, intersecting these ideas. And then this is what provides for us the access to this freedom, this liberated spiritual freedom unto this new dominion and kingdom, right? And we kind of look at it and we ask, well, how is Jesus this, without sin, and then offered as a sacrifice? But then also, how can he, if he had no part in it, even through scripture, it seems to suggest nothing can, in Numbers, you can't atone for something. The only way to atone for something is by shedding the blood, or the blood of one that had shed the blood, right? And so this is kind of where it seems to remedy that portion of it. If you look at it as what Jesus is making reference to in the temple. And so what seems to be kind of intersecting at the point is that he is staking claim that his residence and where he draws spiritual authority from is from the heavenly dominion. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. Basically, I'm anchored in the kingdom of God, which is a dominion outside of this dominion. It's almost like he's appealing to a type of dual citizenship, right? Because he's saying, but I've been born into this world, and so I also navigate into this through this dominion of world kingdoms and this world dominion. And the temple by which this kingdom has absorbed itself into is the temple of Moses. And it's established itself, and it's shared, it's merged its blood accounts through this temple of Moses. And so he draws upon both. There's some people that will attribute this, but we can kind of work out the kinks later, or we can kind of think about it. Some people will attribute some lineage that he has possibly through other factors of like the priesthood, and then some will attribute some lineage to like David, so like the merging of like the kings and the priests, or there's some other connotations, like people can kind of work out some of those. But anyway, some of the claims that he seems to be making is that he has some kind of association and claim to being built into the priestly, like what would you call it, like those set aside for the work of the temple, attributed to the work of the temple. He even says that, you know, when it talks about him as a child, they're looking for him, and he says like to his parents, because he ended up working at the temple, and then they find him in the temple, and he says something like, they're looking for him, and like, Jesus, we couldn't find you. And he says something like, don't you know that I would be about my Father's business in the work of the temple, and something to that effect. So through various modes of association, he is producing this type of claim to being among those that are set apart for the work of the temple. And so then that introduces this connotation when you look back in like the Hebrew text, when it talks about those that are like set apart for the work of the temple, it kind of draws upon the like the Levitical priesthood. So the Levitical priesthood, you know, like is in association with like the law of Moses and unto the temple and whatnot. And they're basically like the Levitical priesthood, when they were making reference to the certain inheritances of the different tribes at the time, they set apart the tribe of Levi as those that would not get a land inheritance, but they would their inheritance would be God, and they are set apart for the work of the temple. And there were certain other things attributed to them in reference to their inheritances through God, through the work of the temple and whatnot. Other ways that people can suppose and think, like, basically what we're trying to resolve is like, how does Jesus utilize the code to build himself into this transitional stage of being the temple? And so you kind of like working through that in the text. Another aspect or avenue that you could take is through the free will offering. So the free will offering is you know, kind of like a quick summary is like there's various offerings, but it's kind of more of like a spiritual receptivity type offering, where they kind of lay out and introduce the needs of the temple and what's needed for the preservation of the temple. And then people go and kind of do some soul searching, and they seek out ways that they will be spiritually stirred to give a free will offering on behalf of the temple. So around the time when they were doing free will offerings, and people's hearts would be stirred and they would be responsive to the needs of the temple and the stage of development for the temple, they would provide these offerings. And at times it was things that they could offer, like weaving, or even like certain metals or resources and things on behalf of the temple. And so at the time, this was actually prior to it being named temple, it was the tent of meeting. And then they would use some of these tools and materials that were offered on behalf of the temple to literally be sometimes like attributed as types of payment or support. But initially at the beginning, it was not so much a substitutionary monetary donation, but like a physical material, whether it be a talent or donation of like material to build the temple to be established, and sometimes literally melted down into moldings for developing the tent of meeting. And so through the free will offering, their portions would literally be integrated into the physical manifestation of the tent of meeting. The tent of meeting then evolves into what the temple becomes. And so you have these certain codes and approaches to the temple. So another avenue that Jesus could be supposing that he's using the protocol to integrate himself into it is that he could be saying, as he does the soul searching and spiritual receptivity to the needs of the temple, he is offering himself as a free will offering. as like a literal physical free will offering to the temple, and saying like, I'm a living offering to the temple, built in, and so it could be as though he's like a roundabout saying, I'm literally being built into the temple. But basically what we're kind of getting to is this whole storyline in reference to the temple seems to become the mechanism by which it fulfills that part, that technicality of nothing can atone for the blood spilt except by the one that spilt the blood. And so what seems to be happening is that the temple becomes a mechanism by which it becomes like a building together of a unit that shares in a type of blood guilt. And so the temple becomes this substitutionary integration of carrying the load of the blood guilt, the accounts, attributed to a type of holding the space of those that shed the blood, and doing a substitutionary type offering on behalf of them. So then what you get from this is, I think it might be in Hebrews in the New Testament, when there's like different proposals on, people aren't certain who wrote Hebrews, but I think it's in Hebrews, where it talks about this and it makes reference to this, and it says, but we know that continually sacrificing substitutionary like sacrifices, animal sacrifices, never really atones for the blood, right? It seems to be making reference to is that the writer in that portion of the letters in the New Testament is kind of saying, there's an argument here that never really atones for the blood. It becomes like a symbolic practice of holding space for people to kind of share the weight of blood accounts, to be this arbitration, and to go through kind of like a ceremonial blessing that doesn't really ultimately atone for the blood. It just accumulates and like kind of creates this account that's never really canceled, right? So in some roundabout way, we're looking at these stories, right? And we're like, how do they ever cancel that? How do they ever at least put it in check, right? Because it's just this like accumulated blood account where it's just kind of symbolically working to manage, and kind of like be this, in an ideal sense, arbitration for certain types of blood spill and certain types of account. But then people are also corrupting it, and there's like money involved, and et cetera, et cetera. And so then how do we look though at like what Jesus is doing? And so what it kind of seems like is Jesus makes these various claims where he says stuff like, we're in the world, but we're not of it. And he makes this claim that he's of this other heavenly dominion. And it's in this like heavenly dominion that he draws upon as being like he's like, that's what his citizenship is, this kingdom of heaven, right? So then through this, he starts critiquing the world kingdom and kind of like portraying how it's not really resolving the things that it's laying claim to, or having this divinity, or resolving some of these things. And then the temple mechanism had become corrupt, and it's not serving the purposes and whatnot, or leading people closer to God, and et cetera, et cetera. This seems to be the stage where it's important in like Paul's argument to portray that like Jesus actually fully died. And he seems to be making that argument because there needs to be this sense of it's through the death, and his death being at the hands of this intersecting of like the temple and the world dominion, that then calls into question this confrontation of an account that can't really be held within the world temple like protocol. And So this kind of goes into, so I'll just kind of like go through this and not get into some of the other questions that people have about like whether Jesus literally died and whatnot. I think, we'll kind of get there. But what it seems to be happening at this stage, at least in terms of what also like Paul and various ones seem to be making reference to, is that to some degree, God seems to be showing this revelation in the story. So there's these certain accounts where Peter, I think it's in the book of Peter, where he's making reference to how the disciples at the time of Jesus had this spiritual confrontation where they're taken up to this mountain, and there's this spiritual experience, and this is where they, prior to this, they don't really know what Jesus is doing, and Jesus is having these spiritual experiences, and then they go up into this mountain, and they account for, and they testify to having this like this revelation from God, where God says, like, this is my son, this is my son in who I'm well pleased, or something to that effect. There's like kind of different variations of it, but basically like God is like saying that like Jesus is a part of his dominion and whatnot. Then what becomes established there is this sense where Jesus is a part of this like dominion of God. So we kind of get that stage where even God through a revelation concurs, like, this is my son, he is of this kind of citizenship in the kingdom of God. Like he is, through this spiritual experience, like it's concurred that he is like manifest in this other kingdom dominion. So then at this stage where Jesus then is making reference to being in the world but not of it, that he draws his sustenance and his spiritual authority from this heavenly kingdom, what you start to find is like in the practice of him adhering to that type of revelation comes into confrontation with the dominions of the world. And so through that stage of confronting and his continual loyalty to this like kingdom of God and the spiritual revelation, then kind of compels him to develop this eventual willingness to surrender his life ultimately unto this alternative kingdom and dominion, even at the cost of giving himself to like confronting these world powers. And so then it develops into the stage where he eventually develops into surrendering and having a willingness to surrender his life into these mechanisms to kind of break free from these dominions. So then at this stage you see him becoming what then is like the willing offering, kind of like the free will offering, being given over to confront these, like, this intersection of interactions between the temple and the world dominion, right? What then becomes established at this point is basically a confrontation of world, or like of dominions, the kingdom dominion, the heavenly dominion, and the world power dominion. And so there's like these competing kingdoms, at least like in the story, right? Then here's the portion of the story, that people maybe are familiar with like Jesus laying down his life, and then it talks about for the atonement of the sins. So let's kind of, I guess we'll just try to unpack this in line with what I'm trying to make reference to here. And so what you get is these competing dominions, and the general tendency is that the powers would then try to overpower one another. And so then you see that generated, and you see this alliance between the temple and the world dominion countering this other claim for this like heavenly kingdom. But you also see that they don't really exactly know how to articulate what's going on. They just view it as a threat to their power system. They don't really seem to understand the major ramifications of what's going on in the larger scheme of things. So basically then they get into this power struggle and, talking a big talk, and they're basically saying like, we'll put an end to you. And they're not imagining that part of the plan or part of the approach. So part of the approach could simply like in a lot of situations, could be that people could have a total 180 turnaround and relinquish their dominion and behave in ways that are attributed to the aspects of life. There's like that option, right? But there's a power struggle, and so people just generally don't take that option. So the other option is that they push their power to the point of showing itself and acting out their dominion power. And so then that's what happens is Jesus confronts this power, this dominion. It shows itself through the mechanisms that it then proclaims and reveals through its methodology, of which then at the time of that stage of dominion becomes like crucifixion, right? Crucifixion in relation also concurring to like the establishment of the temple. The reason why it's important for Jesus to kind of go through the mechanism also of critiquing the temple, from one is like that's the practice he's trying to like transition out of, but on another is because he is trying to alleviate not just world dominion, but calling into confrontation these blood accounts, right? And then also the other forms of remedy in reference to alleviating like the stage of belief in the temple and the law and whatnot. This is where in the story, when he's confronting the temple establishment and also the world dominion, it has to be then established and incorporated within their accounts, within their legal code. And so then he is like through, you know, kind of speaking truth to power, that kind of thing. They show themselves and they flex their power in their mechanism and methodology. And they basically then sentence through the legal code, through the system, through their functions and methodology. It goes through the temple and then it goes through like the dominion. They establish him as these various claims, and then he becomes sentenced through their criteria and their standard in like for punishment and crucifixion. What seems to be occurring here as to how this, you know, like utilizes some of the mechanisms to kind of like put it in check and confront it, is that to resolve for, you know, the claims of saying you can't like the one who sheds blood, or to atone for the shedding of blood, has to be the one who shed the blood, right? And so that's where people say it doesn't seem to make sense, because Jesus didn't do anything and he was like convicted, and it says he was sinless. And so how can he atone for blood that he didn't spill? And so this is where it seems important to look at or kind of question how he's attributing himself to being incorporated into the temple and whatnot. So one of the mechanisms that the temple seems to function as is almost becoming in itself a type of the shared body of like documenting the action of the spilling of blood. And so that, I guess I'll kind of have to unpack that a little bit. So kind of what I'm saying is there seems to be this use that the story is using where the temple becomes kind of like the mode by which certain types of authority are given to certain representations that carry the blood accounts, I guess you would say. And so there's this certain portion where you can see through the stages of the law that it then starts to some degree, there's probably a lot more unpacking to do here, and I'm just going to try to do kind of like a quick overview of it. But there's this stage where it starts to make certain land delegations, and so incorporating in the stage of like developing counterpoints to things going on, there becomes this stage incorporated where certain dominions and regions and lands and allocations then become kind of like collective allocated representations of like certain stages or certain degrees of responsibility for like blood accounts. And so you start to see that established within dominions, like say of world powers. But then you also see, it seems like it starts to become established within the symbolism of the temple, that it also incorporates within itself both like the land delegations, but then also like this unique representation of the temple as a place that is the delegating of responsibility of the blood accounts in relation to the region. And it's kind of like this like unique interaction where it then says that portions of the inheritance of those that are set apart to do the work of the temple are given an inheritance of God or unto God. So the temple stands between this other type of dual citizenship, possibly in some respects, as to they're the arbitration and mediation between the land allotments and the inheritance of God. There could also be this aspect approaching this topic as like, maybe Jesus doesn't have some type of like official connection to the temple or not. So these are just things to kind of suppose, like what's going on here in this language. But it could also be that, so with some of the other tribes of Israel, like they had land inheritances. And because, like in relation to having land inheritances, then the responsibility of the temple in their inheritance, like not having land inheritances, was to do the work of the temple as like an inheritance unto God, as like an expectation in relation to being held accountable unto the standards of God. And so what you kind of seem to find is that at some degree or some level, possibly, like trying on these ideas, like when Jesus, it's proclaimed that he is given this certain dominion and spiritual authority as being in the citizenship of this heavenly kingdom. So he's seeming to lay claim to being outside the temple prior to the temple realizing that. And so he isn't necessarily adhering to the law of Moses in that same sense. To some degree he is. So there is kind of like a crossover, like a convergence, but he's also laying claim to this other kingdom dominion. And he also seems to be a part of one of the tribes that has like these inheritance of the land allotment. And so one of the things that has to do with like the inheritance of the land allotment is that they also kind of bring their offering of, just like the accounting and protocol in having a type of arbitration unto the temple and the workers in the service of the temple. So along these lines, as we're kind of establishing what this seems to mean or represent, and there's, like I said, a lot to unpack and kind of like interpret there. On some level, though, there seems to be this language going on with like the temple and these dominions and these kingdoms and the blood accounts and whatnot. And so, there are some mechanisms that you can kind of suppose. So through this stage, it's still kind of trying to account for how does he become a part of like sharing in the guilt without having really been the one that's guilty, right? And so this is one of the things that people try to resolve. And there is some type of symbolism that people suppose, like the guilt offering, where through some standards and mechanisms, like the priests would lay upon a substitutionary sacrifice, animal sacrifice, the guilt of the people or the blood guilt, right? So it would like encapsulate and incorporate the blood guilt and place it upon a sacrificial lamb or some type of like animal sacrifice, and it would represent holding the guilt of the nations and whatnot. And then they would, have certain protocol that
like would incorporate these things, right? But it still ends up being, like it says, like, how could that ever really atone for these things, right? But you could take the approach of saying this had become incorporated in this like alliance between the world systems and the temple, because the world dominion had incorporated and had drawn into itself the standard of the temple at the time. So you could say, at least according to its own standards, this was its protocol. This was a functioning mechanism within this system, is that part of their very own standard by which they functioned was to practice some of these types of like substitutionary like sacrificial protocol that would be representative in those dominions, in those land dominions. And so there was this sense where dominions and territories then speak through the language and then are representations of the standard by which they function through, right? Could maybe suppose that through their own standard, through their own very functioning mechanism, that was a standard that they drew upon themselves, even if in the grand scheme of things it ultimately couldn't necessarily like exactly atone for various blood spill in that same type of way. Anyway, we can kind of suppose about that in a variety of different ways and kind of like unpack these ideas. But even so, though, it was their very standard that was being called upon and practiced, right? And a representation of the intersecting of the dominion and the temple, the world dominion and the temple. And so then you can kind of look at, well, what was like Jesus confronting then? And so like at this time, in terms of him becoming a type of like citizen of another kingdom, he's kind of countering this kingdom and then being incorporated into it and becoming a type of free will offering unto it, in a sense. And you could say that's supposed after the fact, like some of the language. But basically what you find is the system, like how you see it play out. Like the temple and the system alliance then sentence him through their own standard, through their own legal code, and through their own shared like spiritual practice that becomes a representation of their dominion and their authority. And they sentence him through that system. And so then they become like liable for the shedding of the blood, right? And so this is kind of getting very like, I'm kind of like talking my way through this. It's kind of difficult to unpack. There's a lot more that needs to go into it. This is probably the difficult portion where the distinctive aspect of the story is approaching what is going on with the blood accounts, because it's really the intersecting point of the temple and the world dominions and the things that Jesus seems to be making reference to, is like this whole death and the blood and all of these things. So on a very basic level, if you're looking at different kingdoms, they basically kind of draw upon themselves like the various like accounts of representation of like there's certain standards and their claims that they draw upon themselves. So on some basic level, what you're finding is that Jesus is saying he's of this other dominion. It's an oppositional dominion unto the world kingdoms, and he is confronting their very mechanisms by which they function. It's kind of, possibly saying something to the effect of like, when they convict him and condemn him based on their own standard and law and mechanisms, and then they also like sentence him to crucifixion, and then they also basically like have his blood in their accounting, then it basically kind of supposes then that these blood accounts are then compared to the balancing of like kind of being attributed to this other dominion then having a claim to balance these accounts. I worry that this is kind of just getting
like way too complicated in terms of these reference points. And so maybe to try to like kind of simplify it a little bit is there seems to be some connotations to like Jesus making reference to be, you know, like a type of citizenship drawing upon this other like heavenly dominion, coming into conflict with this like worldly dominion, and then the mechanism of navigating these like blood accounts and whatnot seem to have some function there, right? And it has a connotation to the temple. And in some respects, you can kind of suggest that at some point, balancing the scales of the blood accounts wasn't really something that they were functionally seeming to take as serious. They were kind of fudging the numbers, and the world dominions seemed to really care about balancing, you know, like the blood accounts and whatnot. So you can also kind of look at like, what was Jesus doing though? What was the mechanism of utilizing and functioning through like the blood accounts or confronting it when it wasn't even a mechanism that seemed to have a legitimate standard at that point anyway? And like the world dominion was just kind of running rampant and minimizing the standard of life and whatnot. So you can kind of question at that point, is one of the main aspects of confronting the blood accounts was to basically kind of break the stage of the temple sacrificial system as really not functioning to bring or draw upon any type of like, at that stage, like spiritual transformative value in the sense of like a transformative approach on the world stage. Even if they had wanted to, it was just being infiltrated and generating various functions that were just technicalities through like the world dominion system. And so then the question would be like, was there even any power in like confronting it? What was really going on? And so one aspect of what seemed to be going on was simply that Jesus was like bringing an end to the temple's sense of authority in having claim to that type of mechanism. And so it was kind of like in the like spiritual realm, like possibly like canceling out to that aspect of authority. So then the question might be, well then, even if that was the case, if it was like reclaiming a type of spiritual authority over like these blood accounts and the managing of the sacrificial system in the temple and whatnot, how was Jesus doing that, even in terms of like the technicalities, even though they weren't seeming to show any type of power at the time? And you know, because even like in Hebrews it says like the, you know, like kind of becoming like ritualistic and these ongoing perpetual sacrifices, never really atoning for, you know, never really arriving upon the thing yet, like the change mechanism and whatnot. There could be some aspect of where it's simply kind of saying the call of the priests to enact some of these practices was part of them having a certain inheritance as unto God, and also like the certain like management of like the land allotment attributed to Israel, but they still didn't necessarily possibly like seem to have to account for those anymore, because it had said like basically like the covenant had been broken. And so, you know, ultimately, even though some of it seemed to be functioning in certain fractured remnants, the portion that seemed to need to be reclaimed by God, for God to like be attributing to and not leaving God's own like attributes like just kind of lingering unresolved. And so there could be some sense of like it simply being an act where Jesus is drawing it back to a reference point of being resolved unto God or something to that effect, where it also like accounts for much more than that. But in some form there seems to be like a function of bringing an end to that type of function in reference to God, because then you see like this symbolism of when Jesus is then sentenced through the system, and then when he does actually die, at least story-wise, it says like the temple of the dividing curtain in the temple between like the holy place that was set aside in a representation of God in terms of the temple through the Levitical priesthood under the law of Moses, had then had some form of being brought to its completion, because then you see at that time the curtain is ripped, and that separation between access to God within the temple was seeming to be brought, like functioned as some type of like spiritual breakthrough, and then transitioning unto a shift unto God. And so in some ways, you could say that God had built into this whole mechanism a way to draw it back unto himself, to where it's not as though it's like null and void, like entirely. It's like they're part of their inheritance, and built into it gathers unto the Levitical priesthood, and their inheritance is then attributed to God. And so you can kind of see, even as some of the peripheral things kind of like chisel away, there is a sense of it being referenced back unto God. So there still is a sense of like, attributing after the sense of like deconstructing as residing still within the inheritance of God, but it's just, there's no more of these like limiting factors and whatnot, which then also is like a testimony to simply getting back to the mechanisms of existence, and like the revelation of God still like us being created in this imagery of still having some portion of like attributed to some inheritance or connection to God, like in the lingering effects of just like simple existence and whatnot. But to also kind of get into looking at, though, like some of the other aspects of Jesus and whatnot, and what seemed to be going on there, though, to be like portraying like a functional aspect of this breakthrough seemed to be, at least in the language of the story, that getting back to this like heavenly citizenship and like this spiritual call that he is like a son or citizen of from this heavenly dominion, which there's also a language there in like the old stories of like kings having certain attributing of their sons as being a part of their dominion and whatnot. And so that was also like a language. There's like also these references in like Daniel, in the book of Daniel, this expectation of eventually like the son of man seated at the right hand of God. And so even like kings and various ones would make references similar to those, and it's just kind of like incorporating these certain lineages of like certain ones being attributed to their dominion. So utilizing that type of language, like kings and their sons, and seated with them in their dominion. And so it's like using that kind of language to portray this other type of citizenship onto this other competing dominion. And so what you find at the time, and maybe a portion of what could have been calling out like the temple in the line of Moses at the time, is that it had been the temple in reference to world dominion at a time where, at least story-wise, it was a dominion that had mostly, in respect to looking at kingdoms at the time, like attributed to dominion over the earth, right? I mean, you can look at history and say, well, there's some places where they didn't seem to have dominion over, but in terms of like the peak of dominion, you can kind of roughly say that. And so in some sense, it's kind of like this challenge of where would there ever be any kind of counterpoint to this like gridlock of this world dominion? What other type of dominion would oppose this dominion? And then how would it call out this function of the temple within? And so it is kind of introducing this like counter dominion, this heavenly dominion. And it's like having this certain spiritual connection to Jesus. People can say, I mean, you could suppose, like, what does that mean? Is it just because he was spiritually anointed and then he was committing himself to this dominion of God? I mean, it could be. you could look at this text and say, well, was there some type of divinity and whatnot? But anyway, there's like other times of supposing some of those things. And I think right now I'm just kind of looking at what does it seem to be making reference to in terms of systems and the temple and the representation of what that means in reference to this confrontation. And so it does seem like there's a necessary portion where they are making that distinction of these different territories and opposition. And so then what that causes to seem to portray is it challenges the accounting, I guess you would say. It challenges the way that like the blood accounts would be balanced, at least in the spiritual aspect of things. Even if like the people weren't taking it seriously, at least in the spiritual domain of like God settling his own accounts and whatnot and reclaiming some of these things. And so it does seem like in the story there's something in reference to that going on. And so that seems to be some level of what is like confronted when they take this citizen that's from this other dominion and they place upon him this type of a representation of a dominion. So that becomes like a representation. When you have these certain allocations, then you become a representation of a certain dominion if you have that type of like political authority, right? And so there's a different level of responsibility. And so he's like, what's bestowed upon Jesus is this type of like citizenship in relation to God and whatnot, in confrontation to these other dominions. And so they have this type of like sentencing. And so then if we kind of revisit the sentencing, then it's this notion where this certain person is like sentenced and convicted of these certain things, and it's kind of written into their legal code. And on one end, it's kind of saying that he's taking upon himself like the full accounting of that system and the claims and countering it and opposing it, because he is of a different system. And so then that kind of like brings him into being susceptible to I think one of the mechanisms that kind of calls into question like kind of putting a check on like the temple sacrificial system and atonement and whatnot. Like there's a lot, like I feel like I'm having difficulty oversimplifying something, so I'm kind of like talking round and round. But one aspect is that the Levitical priesthood has a certain type of standard unto God, and then Jesus is laying claim to this certain type of citizenship in kind of like a different mechanism in relation to that dominion of God. And he's countering like the world dominion. It also seems to encapsulate countering like the temple. And so basically what he's kind of doing is he's opposing this like dominion in this whole system with another alternative dominion and system. And so when they go through basically like in the spiritual aspect of things trying to balance the accounts, it doesn't balance. Like it doesn't quite balance. And so it seems to like put it in check or possibly cancel it, or like certain language that you can use along those lines. There's other language that we can kind of look at. I'll probably just kind of have to like wrap this up, and then kind of thinking about this, like this strange introduction to this stage of the text, like unpacking and developing, articulating what seems to be kind of going on there in terms of these like interactions. But like on a simple note, what it seems to be claiming, like some of the outcomes seem to be that it relieves people of this kind of sacrificial code, that it eventually draws upon being returned to God, that it kind of cancels the peripheral and the excesses of it, that it ends up taking something that eventually was kind of being misused or like no longer taken seriously and wasn't really functioning in that type of way, and like returns it back unto God. And then Jesus confronts this dominion and like ushers in the ability to like transition to this other heavenly dominion. And so it kind of alleviates people from this like sense of false loyalty to something that just was not continuing to function in the way that it like needed to function. And ultimately, if it was evolving along the way of its spiritual path, it would have recognized, like transitioning into, like kind of being written on our hearts and minds, and like deconstructing the effects of like world dominions and a variety of other things and whatnot. And so you kind of see that through these stages of things, ultimately it kind of plants the seed to like deconstruct all of the like the mechanisms and aspects of what keeps the world dominion functioning in the way that it does, and like references it all to kind of like over time go through these like dissolving of it, and then like shifting into this like other like heavenly dominion. And so you kind of see some of the story there. So when you have some of the where it's like attributing to, it's saying stuff like Jesus died for our sins, he's our atoning sacrifice for our sins, through his atonement then we have this like access and this renewal and spiritual connection to God and whatnot. In practice, what it seems to be kind of portraying and saying is it's helping provide people this revelation that they don't have to keep, like kind of going through some of these like certain protocol and stages, that there's levels where it's like kind of being fulfilled, and there's these certain mechanisms where you can kind of draw upon these practices that can actually help to like spiritually transform and kind of like shift it and bring it into like the spiritual connotation of how would you say it, like being reacclimated into this alignment to God, and the like being able to kind of like work through that like spiritual kind of like atoning and refining in one's life in that similar language that Jesus says, like, we're in the world but we're not of it. And so making reference unto this like spiritual authority that's been reclaimed into like the heavenly dominion. And so it kind of says stuff like, then people can understand that everything that's been done has been done through God, and there's these certain ways to kind of like deconstruct, and it's kind of been brought to like its full measure and the parameters and the system of death. And then the system of death ultimately is like positioned and pointing toward like this other kind of like heavenly dominion, where like it sets it into like over time being less and less of a system of power, like this like world system. So there becomes this like there's a lot of things, like some questions to kind of unravel there. There was like a lot of ground covered, and it still referenced this point of having to unpack these stages of the symbolism of the temple and whatnot. Like that's the area where the like that work of Jesus in terms of like the symbolism of the crucifixion in reference to Rome, and these certain enactments and confrontation with the temple, and what does it mean then to have gained this like revelation, this understanding onto like spiritual practices in like this heavenly dominion, and how it facilitates a lot of these certain practices and actions that like people are attributing to this like message of Jesus and the Christ and whatnot. In some way, you have to kind of look at the time within like the Jewish tradition, because this initially starts out as like a liberating movement for like the Jewish groups that were looking for, like in some ways like a free. They're looking for certain various types of freedom, whether it be like the occupying forces or like the corruption within the temple establishment. But then, as we were saying before, needing some type of felt spiritual authority that they can give this type of spiritual permission to be a part of moving out from these corrupt systems or these systems that had become corrupted and were basically kind of like oppressing like the Jewish people at the time, because that was their tradition, and it had gotten to the point where it kind of stopped functioning in the way that it was supposed to, or in the spirit of what it was supposed to at that time. And so another mechanism that was needed for them to feel this freedom to enter into spiritual liberation was they needed a way to basically kind of like concur that they had in a sense had a revelation to feel this freedom bestowed upon them to kind of move outside of those expectations and requirements and to still feel like they're in the path of God. And so it seems like a lot of the language in that sense is like speaking to saying you do have spiritual freedom and you'll still be in line with the path of God, outside of these like the establishment and the temple and whatnot. And so it was actually something that they really needed in the sense of like a revelation of understanding. And so you can kind of see the language initially would have been like Jesus had portrayed this sense of fulfilling the stage to give you spiritual authority to shift outside of those requirements. And so then you get the language of like it's saying he atoned for the sins, and he became through his sacrifice he had basically in some kind of language won the rights for them to feel confident in spiritual practice outside of these requirements. In some ways, maybe you could kind of try on the idea that maybe to them, in terms of the spiritual legalities of it, they can say, well, we are arguing our point for being citizens of the heavenly kingdom, and in reference to the lineage and in the spirit of the law of Moses, and in that sense the temple has established itself as in the accounts of this new heavenly kingdom by sentencing Jesus through the the testimony of the temple in relation to the dominion system at the time. And so they have established themselves, and the temple has drawn upon within their own criteria in themselves as being among the accounting of this heavenly kingdom. I feel like I'm kind of introducing this idea, but I feel like I'm not quite getting to what I'm trying to say. And I don't really want to leave it lingering on this note, but I kind of feel like there's this other sense of contribution that I kind of wanted to draw upon. And so I'm hesitant to kind of leave it here because I wanted to get more toward what it seems like I'm saying, as opposed to some of the interpretations that various ones seem to have, where looking at the blood accounts and making these certain attributing it to various ones in history and whatnot. I didn't want to leave it on that note, but I still feel like I'm kind of talking around this subject. But I do feel like I've introduced it enough for people to kind of think about it and look at or question what's going on there then with this part of the story, because this seems to be portions of the story. They're talking about world dominions, they're talking about the temple and the establishment and the legal code and spiritual authority. Even if I was saying before, even if some of the practices had simply become holding places and wasn't really producing I mean, we see that a lot with like various traditions and beliefs. Like it can kind of get to the point where it's departed from like the core of its like spiritual attributing, and it's not like always functioning to connect to the ongoing flow of like change and refinement and whatnot. But even so, even if it had got to that point, like the question also is like, Jesus still felt the need or like the spiritual conviction to enter into it and bring a transformative value to it. And so you can kind of think like, well, they could have just moved on with their movement and had some type of like spiritual confidence that they have authority to move on with their movement, but they still like tied up loose ends, and they still kind of confronted and fulfilled and brought into transition this stage through like the temple and the establishment and whatnot. And so it is kind of just introducing those stages of questioning, why is it using that language, why is it kind of laying claim to a type of like spiritual confrontation through these types of like mechanisms, to the point where in the story it says there's like a spiritual confrontation and it breaks open like the curtain, the dividing like curtain between God and man, and it ushers in this new like authority and dominion and whatnot, at least in the spiritual realm. But in the physical reality, they still are like oppressed and occupied, but they've actually at least like drawn out the like disguise of like a spiritual authority that various ones had and were functioning with, and they tend to seem to have gotten away with the type of spiritual authority. So then their movement then continues to move forward with this separation of like drawing out from this world dominion this spiritual authority. And so it seems to lay claim to having this spiritual authority and this path of God, but it still is confronting these world systems and whatnot. The system then starts to like persecute them, and there's even these like attacks from the establishment of the temple and whatnot. And so the question there is, do people then look at it as like a legitimate claim to like the spiritual path and the ongoing revelation of God? Like, does it really account for like the claims and the testimony and the prophecies of what is said to eventually be able to be enacted like within like spiritual practices, like the law being written on hearts and minds and some of these things? And so it is a very complex story. There's a lot going on with it. There's certain connotation to it. It seems to like tap into certain kind of behaviors in society and whatnot. And it seems to lay claim to this idea that giving testimony to like we're built in this imagery of like spiritual creatures with spiritual type of attributes, and some of these functions seem to give testimony to like the diminishing forces are like on a systemic level, certain systems and powers, and that there are acclimating teachings and approaches and stages of revelation that we see through like the temple and these stories and whatnot. And so, then at the end of the day, the outcomes of it, like we're like made reference to earlier, is this notion of continually dismantling this this kind of like diminishing of our liberation through systems and powers, and then also like drawing upon this confidence that we can have to refine a type of spiritual connection as we then concur that seems to be this revelation that we have spiritual attributes within us that kind of draw us into this ability to connect and refine our lives into this like spiritual connection to God. And as we do that, then we just kind of awaken this certain standard of corrective measure in our life personally, and then collectively as we refine the systems by which we live in reference to the attributes of what these types of spiritual freedom are. And so you do see that the story seems to draw upon those, and there's a lot of like complex language and symbolism, and so there's like definitely still room to unpack those ideas and and consider them, making reference to them. So like a quick side note though, because we're also trying to like negotiate between other like religious interpretations and whatnot. And so there is kind of this question, and I don't know, maybe I should save this for another time, but I'll just kind of say almost every one of these topics, there's going to need to be room to unpack it even more and like, like kind of go over these more thoroughly and check them in relation to like what the story seems to be saying. But this idea of like the crucifixion, some people will say we can't give room to negotiating with Islam because they seem to deny the crucifixion and like the death and resurrection of Jesus and the divinity and things along those lines. At this point in time, in negotiating this and thinking and looking at the scripture, you can kind of see how at least the portion of divinity, we can kind of look at that and unpack it according to scripture and whatnot. But there actually does seem to be something to the notion that Jesus was saying something a little bit different than how it's been interpreted. And so I introduced that idea in reference to the incarnation and the connection and the atonement aspects of things seem to actually be attributed to Jesus through the language of him becoming the temple by which then it's revealed that God resides within us, within our bodies. And so when it does utilize that language of God in the flesh, there does seem to be this language where it's maybe not quite making reference to a divinity of Jesus in the way that maybe we've interpreted. And so there is room to look at and examine that. There is a sense of divinity in reference to Jesus in the sense that the Spirit of God is said to reside within him, likened to him becoming a type of the incarnation of the temple. So almost like the tent of God, which you can see maybe that would kind of line up with some groups, even with certain forms of Judaism and Islam, where they say it doesn't seem to make sense attributing that Jesus was God as much as Jesus housed God. There was a flesh, Jesus in the flesh could be, considered in the sense of God was in the flesh of the tent of meeting. And that does seem to have some type of legitimacy to at least looking in and examining that, because even Peter in the book, I think it's in 1st or 2nd Peter or somewhere in the New Testament, one of the disciples or the apostles make reference to themselves saying this tent that houses God, he's kind of getting to the stage where it's been communicated to him in his spiritual seeking time that he's nearing the end of his life and he's readying himself for a level of sacrifice unto this movement. There does seem to be certain language that they start using as being the tent of God, our physical bodies are the tent of God. And so it does seem to make sense, because when we do start looking and examining what was Jesus actually saying then in terms of how he was kind of being built into this mechanism through this symbolism of the temple. So there's that aspect that we can look at. And then also in terms of the crucifixion, some of it seems to be making reference to when it talks when I've briefly examined some of the scripture, within the Islamic teachings, it doesn't really, there's not some really exhaustive countering argument against crucifixion. There just seems to be very few references that make claim to the crucifixion. And what it kind of seems to be saying in reference to some of the other points that it's making is Islam actually seems to be arguing the point and concurring that there was a unique spiritual calling that Jesus had. They're not denying that Jesus had a unique spiritual calling. and that he was like a pivotal character in the culmination of these like spiritual revelation. And what it also seems to be referencing is, it doesn't seem to be referencing like a denial of that, you know, how people make reference to saying like Islam denies like the crucifixion, in the sense that this whole thing didn't really happen, as much as what it seems to be making reference to is that it's saying the confrontation, like the function of crucifixion wasn't successful, in the sense of like the purpose of the crucifixion was to make an example of the movement, and to like the mechanism of like the full practice of crucifixion was like a treacherous, torturous, like prolonged act that would function to put a stop to movements. And so when they're saying like the crucifixion, you know, basically in some respect was not successful, is saying that they didn't put a stop to Jesus through the crucifixion. Like it kept going. Like there was still this effect of the revelation of Jesus, and the practice and the call and the fulfillment of Jesus. People will still say, you know, like, well, there still is this question of like the resurrection and things to that effect, where there seems to be this supposing of what happened there, if there seemed to be this question that like looking at the crucifixion differently. And then this goes back to, and I don't know if I'm really prepared to unpack all of this, but I'll just kind of do another generalization. When it goes into like some of the specifics of what seemed to occur with like the resurrection, this is where people are kind of having conversations as to like is the scripture really making reference to the resurrection, where people literally saw like Jesus, like the literal full body of Jesus like resurrected and whatnot. And I could go into this more in depth, but I think at this point I've kind of said a lot. Maybe I'll have to do like a fourth part, or like I was saying before, though, there's going to be like ongoing dialogue about some of these things. But if you do look at like some of the like comparisons of the story in reference to like the death and resurrection, when I started revisiting it after I was like introduced to people having these discussions, some of it does kind of read as like the main point of the comparison of the story is that when Jesus was on the cross, it wasn't crucifixion that ultimately, in some respects, like had the last word, as much as like it kind of reads as though, you know, there definitely was like the facilitating of the sentencing and the punishment, and basically bringing him like right unto the aspect of death. That definitely like had that responsibility, but it kind of reads as though at some level, when it was to be this like prolonged act, it then reads as though he like surrenders his spirit, and then God draws him unto himself. And even to the point where it's almost in, you know, like a sense of mercy, where he's not then required to endure the full length of these types of acts of crucifixion in its prolonged sentencing and torturous like display. I mean, there's some sense where people will say it seems to read as though that's the stage where he's like drawn unto and into the dominion of God at that point. And then later people make these like attributing like these spiritual visitations, it shifts to this like spiritual movement, so people can kind of spiritualize that. And that's what people are also talking about in reference to like, was there like a literal visual like physical body that was resurrected? Even if there wasn't, like, so people can, continue to make reference to that and whatnot. But I kind of took the roundabout way where I was kind of supposing, like, well, what was functioning there, even with the symbolism, whether it's like proven or not, we still need to understand the function of it. So even if there wasn't like a physical bodily resurrection in that same sense, was, as some are supposing, like he's drawn into this kingdom and dominion of God, he surrenders his body and God draws him unto himself. They can kind of attribute that as, like, in a sense, like being brought unto the sentence of death and then being resurrected into the dominion of God. I mean, they could say that, but it kind of reads as though, when you look at Paul, this is why Paul was saying there needed to be like the death, like bringing this into like the full death of it and then the resurrection. But that could even be kind of attributed to a certain language of a completion and a renewal as well. And so I think for me, there's a lot of these like different references that people are making, but I still kind of go back to, like, there still needs to be the effect of like what this like stands for or what the meaning of it is. And there still is some level, like some people might say, well, the full sentencing didn't come into play, even if we're looking at it in terms of like spiritual, like the legalities of like the spiritual conviction or condemnation or whatnot taken upon by him. They could say needed to be like full absolute death and then like full absolute resurrection. But there can also, like we're supposing, and so doing some like interpretive work, but there's also this aspect of there's overlap within what the like full condemnation could be. And so that's kind of where it goes into this overlap with like the criteria of the world system. And so in the dominion of the world powers, to endure their type of like legal like curse, if you will, or like punishment or conviction or condemnation for challenging like the gods, if you will, the god kings. You look at like Nebuchadnezzar's proclamation and Cyrus, and so you kind of get a feel for some of what their claims are. Is there's certain levels of punishment and kind of being the cursed one hung on a tree or brought into this display and endured in these certain sentencing and whatnot. And so in some ways, like the fullness of that being accomplished through their criteria didn't always require like ultimate death as much as like enduring the like the fullness of the punishment, like the legal like punishment for what they're being like convicted of and whatnot. There could also be that sense of people supposing and reflecting on what was occurring there and saying in some respect that the sentencing of crucifixion didn't have the last word, that it didn't it fulfilled the purpose of like becoming like the cursed one under the world dominion and kind of breaking the decree of world dominions in that sense. And so that could be attributed to when they're kind of saying like he wasn't crucified, like some can say like the completion of what occurred was like still in the like there was still a level of like God managing his own willingness to endure certain things. There could be that connotation to it where it's saying like he served the punishment of the system, the dominion, but it wasn't like the dominion, the label of crucifixion that really ultimately had the last word. And so it wasn't crucifixion that brought it to a completion. It was actually his surrender of himself, like he gives himself over and surrenders himself unto God. And then he's drawn into like the holy dominion, So there, like I said, there's still like a lot of like interpretive work to do there, supposing or looking at the text, like what was going on there. But it kind of does seem to make some level of reference along those lines, where it still is attributing it to like God surrendering himself and kind of being that willing offering. There's other ways that you can kind of fulfill that portion, though. Like he doesn't fight he doesn't run off and hide and fight. Like he fulfills the willingness of his offering by simply surrendering to going through this judgment and like the full conviction of it and whatnot. The reason why like if we look at how people will suppose, as we kind of dialogue and discuss about, was there like a literal like resurrection, or was this people having like this spiritual awareness and confrontation of Jesus, or was there a portion, so we can kind of like suppose about that. But I think some of where people are also trying to argue for those points is because, so there is this stage though, like I was saying, where Paul seems to make reference to there needing to be a full death of things. And so that can also be, so in both one sense, they're saying, various ones are supposing, so through the world system, the dominant world system and its conviction through the system is this stage of crucifixion, right? And so when it's saying that crucifixion didn't basically like have the last word, or like he wasn't crucified, or that crucifixion wasn't like the last power, as I was kind of saying, you can kind of say that, or kind of like entertain that idea. He does fulfill that stage of being in the like sentencing of the system, and he's still being a stage of alive to some degree. But then at the stage where, so like kind of basically saying there was some stage where it seemed like God intervened through mercy and draw him to himself as he surrendered himself. There can still be that stage also, though, of like actual literal death that is kind of like bestowed upon himself, like surrendering into that full situation that he finds himself in and not like fighting it anymore. Or, like resist, like having that level of like preserving one's life. And then fulfilling the next stage as unto like the temple aspect of it, where he like releases himself, like it says, I think it's like in Matthew, and he like kind of like gives up the ghost, or he like surrenders himself unto God, and then God draws him into that dominion. So then you can kind of see that portion then is what's then attributed to kind of like the spiritual aspect of it in relation to the temple, where it is brought into like a full death, which then it brings it into like the accounts of like the temple and whatnot, and that reference of like shift and transformation, where then Paul then says there needs to be like the full death, so that it brings that stage into all of the collection of like the death. And then there can be this renewal in this life, because then it breaks the like adherence to that stage of the law and the like kind of like the contract of things and whatnot. In terms of various ones saying, well, then for there to be the full death of it, we can kind of see how it resolves the full death of it as we like unpack some of the symbolism in these interactions. But then they'll suggest there needs to be like a literal physical resurrection for it to seem to like have power over the grave, right? And so then there's this language of Paul, when he talks about this like triumphant victory over the grave or over death, like the system of death, bringing it all to completion so that there can be this renewal and the initiation of unto life. And so to get to that point, people are saying to conquer the system of death, there needs to be this like literal physical resurrection and whatnot. But, maybe it doesn't require that in the fullness of how in this world dominion people like experience our existence. It could be that that is still accomplished by this shifting of these dominions. And so what actually is required for there to be this type of like being rebirthed and drawn into this new life is actually not being fully resurrected into this world dominion in the same form, in the same type of attribute. Because what we find in the story is that this dominion that we're in is like cloaked and veiled and skews the way we see, and is a lens by which we're not seeing properly or experiencing properly. And so it kind of does make sense to think that Jesus would be resurrected into a different dimension or dominion that then would kind of like pierce through, that we would get glimpses of, and that would actually give more proof of like a different dominion that has conquered the present dominion. And so it could give connotation to what some people are making reference to as this like transition of dominions. And it's that of which there needs to be proof of, is the shifting of dominions is actually the resurrection type power, is that we are seeming to function in this renewal through a different type of mechanism, a different type of like lens by which we're starting to see like a hint of it. And so I don't know, there's a lot of things to like think about. I'm hoping it, kind of introduced, I hope it wasn't too like complicated. It felt like for a while there was like kind of talking in circles, but I was trying to introduce the point that I just feel like I need to kind of collaborate with maybe various ones, or like kind of work out what I'm trying to say there, and walk away from it for a moment and try to like articulate more simply what I'm trying to say. But I do feel like I've introduced some of the ideas of what I'm making reference to, and there, like I said, like this was supposed to be kind of like more of an introduction to some of these ideas. Kind of leaves it at this point where there's more to unpack and ideas to kind of look through. But I do feel like it's kind of served as introducing these points of where certain transformative functions can be apparent and practiced, and we could still attempt to like refine and alleviate and reconcile some of these other differences and whatnot. But anyway, I think I'm gonna leave it there for now. I do feel like there's a lot of loose ends to kind of work through, but also just like looking at the story and asking those questions of what does this like in actual life practice really mean, and how does it intersect with people's actual literal lives, and what does it seem to be like attributed to, and then how does that, as it visits our life, cause us to live in these like transformative practices and feeling like we have some level of like authority of or understanding to work through some of these like revelations or ideas and whatnot. So anyway, I think I'm gonna leave it there and just then continue to like work through some of these ideas in I kind of still wish, I'm like hesitant because I feel like I haven't quite wrapped it up in the way that I would like to, but I kind of started out saying that I wouldn't be doing that at this time, and I did kind of cover a lot of ground in introducing some of these portions, and so I guess I'm just going to leave it there for now and kind of see where these ideas surface in other types of contributions and whatnot.